Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, January 2nd, 2024. Happy New Year again. Today we're going to be talking about the race for second place on the Republican primary side, in which new news from CNN announcing that Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, and Donald Trump are the only contenders in the GOP primary who have qualified for this upcoming debate. This comes alongside new data that shows on the Real Clear Politics average and the FiveThirtyEight average that right now Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley are tied for second place. It tells us that we are in a very interesting position when it comes down to our second place candidate on the GOP primary side, just 14 days away from the Iowa caucus. Now, as we get closer to Election Day and we get closer to the all-important election that everybody has been waiting for, Donald Trump mostly, we are starting to see a new picture form about what the Republican primary actually means for the current state of the party. At one point in time, very early on in the primary process, last year even, when Ron DeSantis was within striking distance of defeating President Donald Trump in the GOP primary, the time frame I'm talking about is right around here in January of 2023, where Donald Trump was at 42%, Ron DeSantis was at 33%, but at different periods of time, DeSantis was sometimes closer to the nomination spot. When you take a look at data prior to the 2023 beginning of this year, or actually last year, I forget that we're in a new year, you go back and see that at the end of November and early December 2023, or 2022 rather, Ron DeSantis actually sometimes pulled ahead of where Donald Trump was. But the point is here that back then, a year ago today, the primary was about whether or not Donald Trump would be defeated by Ron DeSantis. Everybody else who had already announced, Nikki Haley included, and many others that would announce in the later months, were nobodies who were never going to get close to taking on Donald Trump himself. So in just around a year, Ron DeSantis goes from 35% support nationwide, Nikki Haley at 2.6%, now down to a point where they're both tied at 11.3% each nationwide. And so instead of the race meaning, back then, who can take on Donald Trump, who could actually challenge him for the nomination, now it's about who's going to be in second place and who is ultimately vying for the VP spot. And a similar thing sort of happened back in 2016. I think what we saw back then was that Donald Trump was really taking it away in the national numbers, not nearly by the margins that he is currently, but was taking it away in the national numbers, and everything else became a race for second place. John Kasich wanted it, Marco Rubio wanted it, Ben Carson wanted it, Ted Cruz wanted it, Carly Fiorina wanted it. Sometimes Cruz and Fiorina joined up to do it again. It was all of these things and all of these candidates out there really who thought they could take on Donald Trump at one point or another, that thought they would be their party's alternative to the frontrunner, never ended up happening, and now they are all ending up facing against each other and tearing each other down. And that's the exact case of what's happening right now with Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, and Nikki Haley, where they both are pulling away from the president, being forced to debate against one another rather than against the one person who they actually need the numbers to bleed from. And they start to attack and pile onto each other while Donald Trump makes out like a bandit. And so that is where the Republican primary has gotten. It is no longer, in any consideration, a competitive primary, and is much more focused and centered around who is running for second place. But I think it is notable. Notable on the side of Ron DeSantis and notable on the side for Nikki Haley for two very different reasons, that they are tied for second place nationwide. As I just showed you those FiveThirtyEight numbers, it's notable for Nikki Haley to go from 2.6% at the start a year ago, January 2nd, 2023, was at 2.6% nationwide, to now at 11.3%. It's not a major increase, but it certainly matters because she went from at one point in time being in 5th, 6th place all the way up to 2nd, and which could make her a very, very prominent figure in the next presidential election if Biden or Trump wins, assuming there isn't a Trump third term go ahead. But regardless, that is notable for Nikki Haley. She has made a significant improvement from where she was earlier on in this primary process. Ron DeSantis, on the other hand, his decrease is significant and notable, but not for good reason. Ron DeSantis being in this primary, again, many Republicans thought would be the Titan Slayer. A lot of people put a lot of backing behind it. Never backed down. The Republicans from the Florida House delegation. The Republicans all across the country who came out in support of Ron DeSantis. Kim Reynolds, the governor of Iowa, just came out in support of Ron DeSantis as well. And so you have all of these figures that genuinely believed that Ron DeSantis was going to be their one-way ticket out of Trump Town, and it ended up not even leaving the station. And now we're at a point where you have Ron DeSantis going from 34.3% a year ago today down to just 11.3%. A collapse that has allowed Donald Trump's rise from 45.9% all the way up to 61.3% as of today. So again, that is what is notable about this GOP primary. How the race has turned so significantly into a race for second place. How for a seemingly while now, 6 months even, 8 months even, there was never a point where Donald Trump was going to lose the nomination. When he hovered over 50 and you started to see him rise and rise and rise, the members of the GOP wing that are not aligned with Donald Trump didn't know what to do, as if they hadn't been through the 2016 election before. But maybe they had. Maybe they knew what to do, but the candidates were too stubborn to get out of the race in the first place. Think about it for a moment. You had all these candidates vying for the anti-Trump vote that only captured, at one point in time, at a bare minimum, 57% of the party. And then it became less than 57%. It became 47%. Then it became 45%. Then it became 40%. And now it's looking more like 39% of the vote in the GOP primary is against Trump, but in terms of second place preference, is still very much open to the idea of him winning the nomination. The position on this, the national stance on this from the GOP a year ago following their abysmal defeat in the midterms in numerous competitive races, was that Donald Trump needed to go. But the voters, the Republican primary voters at least, did not want that to happen. What we are seeing now is that Trump is at 61% nationwide and everyone else is fighting for second place. And so with this Haley-DeSantis matchup, I'm interested to see what is going to happen in terms of their messaging moving forward. Because obviously, they do want to compete against one another, but not in this type of way. What they want in an ideal scenario is that they are the only two in the race, but that obviously isn't going to happen. But on this debate stage, that's how they might treat it. I think it's very telling to the current state of the Republican Party that right now DeSantis and Haley are also the top two making it onto that debate stage. Because for all purposes, they all stand for the same things that Donald Trump do. They just offer a different way of saying it, a different vision in terms of how they would enact it, and a different working relationship with Donald Trump in one way or another. Ron DeSantis, who was risen to the governorship, and in his eyes, the presidency, largely on the back of Donald Trump. You see who he emulated in 2018. You see who got the endorsement of Donald Trump against Adam Putnam in that primary. That was a big deal for Ron DeSantis. Nikki Haley also, sure, she was South Carolina governor, but became even more prominent by being UN ambassador because of Donald Trump. Both of these candidates on this debate stage, in one way or another, have Donald Trump to thank for even being there in the first place. And I'm not here at all to lean into Donald Trump's idea that they owe him anything or that they should not be running because of that. I just think, again, it is very telling to the current state of the party that the prominent political figures are only there because of Trump. It even extends beyond Donald Trump, too. You take a look at the two who were just kicked out of the debate stage, Chris Christie and Vivek Ramaswamy. Well, Vivek Ramaswamy is only a Republican because of Donald Trump, right? You take a look at his party registration, he was a Democrat. Beyond that, too, he's someone who never really voted in the first place. And he made a name for himself by, get this, in a similar fashion to Ron DeSantis, emulating Donald Trump. On the flip side, Chris Christie is here not because he actually thinks he's going to be president, I think that's been very clear, but because he wants to take on, guess who? President Donald Trump. So in one way or another, this is the one guy the Republican universe revolves around, whether it comes down to the primary process, whether it comes down to the general election. This is how the Republican Party has operated over the past 8 years, and when they ask who is the common denominator and why we keep losing, may I present to you the former president of the United States. But they don't care. And we know they don't care because that's why Donald Trump is doing so well nationwide. And so I know I just went a bit off on a tangent here. That's more about what the current state of the GOP looks like and why this race for second place is even narrowing down to DeSantis and Haley and how they even got there to be in this race for second place in the first place. It all comes back to one person, the candidate who is on track to now win Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. But let's visualize this. Let's visualize the race for second place. I've already established probably well enough that Donald Trump's going to be the nominee. But the question again is, what does this look like in the nomination process? Is Donald Trump just going to steamroll all of the states? Well, in a bit of a different shift from what we saw in 2016, The 2024 GOP primary is operating a little bit more proportionally. Some of the state rules are a little bit different, and Republicans who aren't Donald Trump have a little bit better of a chance at actually making a delegate count. In 2016, that wasn't the case. In many states, there were proportional rules, but in some, there weren't. Notably, states like South Carolina, which was a very early state, and notably, Florida, where Marco Rubio was the incumbent senator from. South Carolina is the most egregious one that I think really helped Donald Trump springboard into the presidency. This state gave him 50 delegates despite winning just 32.51% of that vote. Remember how I told you how the Republican primary had already gone through this? The anti-Trump vote nenever coalesced around a candidate, and it was to their detriment. Take a look at this. Marco Rubio got 22% of the vote. Ted Cruz got 22% of the vote. Combine them together, 44%. Add in Jeb Bush, 8%. Okay, you're already over 50. John Kasich, 8%, already over 60, right? You get to a point where all of these candidates, had they backed each other or someone who wasn't Trump, you would have found that they would have performed better, but that doesn't matter because that is already done. I'm not here to talk about Trump as much as I do, and I apologize for that because, again, the video is about Haley and DeSantis. But this gets to the point. Because South Carolina is a state where it was winner take all, and that is what benefited Donald Trump. South Carolina very much has a winner take all system in 2024. They do have a congressional system, though, that allows for candidates like Haley and DeSantis to win over delegates if they win in certain congressional districts. I think Nikki Haley realistically could win maybe 2 out of the 7 in some of the pockets where she is the strongest. Florida, I pointed out just because I thought this was crazy. Marco Rubio, being the senator from the state, dropped out because of this result. Marco Rubio got just 27% of the vote in his own home state. He was a senator here, been elected since 2010, very well known, very well liked, ended up outperforming Donald Trump in the general election by roughly 6 points. And yet, in the GOP primary, ended up getting 27% of the vote. Donald Trump got less than 50, but 100% of the delegates. And so in these early states, this is what I think the race for second place would be visualized like. Because you're working with a lot of states that are proportional, but some that are winner take all, like South Carolina, you start to see just how a Trump victory can make this delegate count so exceptionally lopsided. Take all of this into account, knowing there are 4 candidates on the ticket here. You have Donald Trump getting nearly 70% of all of the delegate counts right off the bat. Nikki Haley getting roughly a good chunk of it, maybe that looking like, what is that, a 7th of the pie. Ron DeSantis in a similar way, and Chris Christie getting very, very narrow to the margin. But in terms of how this would look like, right, you take a look at where the current numbers are in the state of Iowa. Let's actually go ahead and fill so we can just visualize it right now. Well, you take a look at this state. Let's see, actually, it's not should visualize, it should be split. We look at the GOP primary polling data in Iowa. Donald Trump's at 50%. DeSantis is right now at 18%. Nikki Haley's at 16%. And Vivek Ramaswamy is at 6%. Chris Christie's at 4%. And so I don't have Vivek Ramaswamy for all intents and purposes. Let's count in Christie and Ramaswamy just to visualize again what it would look like on the left side so you can start to see how this builds out so heavily in favor of Trump. So even at a bare minimum, if we are to give, Trump 50% of that primary vote, again, breaking it up evenly, giving Nikki Haley maybe 20%, Ron DeSantis maybe 25%, the remaining vote going to Chris Christie and Ramaswamy, again, you see that Trump gets 20 delegates in the state. 8 go to Nikki Haley, 10 go to Ron DeSantis, Chris Christie wins 2. And so that already gives him a very, very strong victory out of the state. He's getting over half the delegates with 4 or 5 candidates, potentially 6 if Asa Hutchinson is still in the race, left in the race. And so Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis are actually in a competitive race, but Trump isn't. And you look at South Carolina and New Hampshire, 2 states that will follow suit. An interesting thing about Nevada, we'll get to that in just a moment, that it'll tell you why Ron DeSantis might be able to pull ahead of Nikki Haley by the very end of the first 4 primary states. But you look at New Hampshire, right? Nikki Haley would get probably a larger chunk than Ron DeSantis. Not as large of a chunk, though, as this seems to be suggesting. Actually, yes. No, this is right. I don't know why I was so shocked. Ron DeSantis is polling worse than Chris Christie in this state. So you see here that Donald Trump would still get around 50% of the vote. That's roughly accurate with what the numbers are saying. Nikki Haley probably around 36%, given that she's winning over a lot of undecided voters and is already around 29, 30% statewide. Ron DeSantis gets around 5%. That's presently where he is in terms of vote count, maybe 8-9%, but in terms of delegate proportion would probably be there too. And Chris Christie would probably get around 9% of the overall delegate count in the state. So you see here that Donald Trump, again, would be brought up. Nikki Haley would get that upper edge over Ron DeSantis. South Carolina, very similar because she is the former governor from that state, but the primary rules are different. I don't care about proportionality when it comes to South Carolina. The only benefit that Nikki Haley has is that she has a smaller, more concrete base in a few congressional districts compared to Ron DeSantis, who will probably still come in at second or third across the state, but doesn't have enough banked-in support from institutional memory, people who like or adore him as a candidate and know him as their former governor like they do Nikki Haley, and so he gets 0 delegates from South Carolina. Nikki Haley potentially gets a fraction of it. Maybe Donald Trump could actually get all of it, but he actually wins it back again, making this again still a competitive race. You're seeing Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. You're telling me, how is Nikki Haley still in the running with Ron DeSantis? Because Ron DeSantis should be way far back. Guess what happened in Nevada? Nikki Haley qualified for the GOP caucus here, but the state legislature, controlled by Democrats, tried to mandate a GOP primary. The one thing about Nevada's GOP is that they will not listen to the state legislature, even if they are being forced to by the state legislature. And so what they said was, okay, you can have your primary, but we will have a caucus. And so the GOP national party agreed with them. And so the Nevada GOP set a mandate that if any Republicans qualify and register to be on the ballot for the Nevada primary, it's non-binding. No matter what happens, you don't win any delegates, and so we will hold a caucus 2 days later that will actually matter and actually have real delegate proportions allocated to the candidates. And so Nikki Haley, for whatever reason, I don't know if anyone knows any background on this or could provide it at the end of the video, or in the comments of this video, but Nikki Haley registered for the primary and cannot register for the caucus. So Ron DeSantis will likely be getting nearly all of that anti-Trump vote, which could bring him to around 38%, probably his best performance, but puts him back at the running with Nikki Haley. And so you see, by the end of this, based on where our current numbers are, Donald Trump would have 91 delegates, Nikki Haley would have 22, Ron DeSantis would have 21, Chris Christie would have around 4, Vivek Ramaswamy probably would have around 2. And so that, on the bare minimum, shows how this race for second place is really shaping up to be not only in the national numbers, but likely to be sculpted as well by these early primary states. Even though everybody is really under this assumption that there isn't going to be a race for second place when it comes down to the actual delegate proportions, I genuinely think there will be. Now, I think after this, Chris Christie's out, Ramaswamy's out, especially if they're not getting any airtime on the national debate stage. They probably aren't going to be prominent figures moving in the future, right? But I do think DeSantis and Haley could stick on a little bit longer, probably around till the end of February, maybe early March at the latest, and then they drop out because Donald Trump either clinches the nomination outright or ends up just dominating to a point where they see no pathway forward for them, even in a race for second place. But I do think that this race for second place has been shaping up for quite some time now, only reaffirmed by the tied national numbers that tell us that this story is evolving the exact way we expect it to, that the race for second place was not going to hinder Donald Trump at all and only force these two candidates to face off against each other and fight for the bare minimum and the scraps left over by former President Donald Trump. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos, Republican primary election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.